Thank you so much.
Okay. Seeing the presence of a quorum, I'm going to call to order the Budget Subcommittee of the Regional School Committee at 6:35 p.m. on Thursday, December 17th, and do a roll call. Hala?
Hala present.
Carrie? Ms. Spitzer present?
Spitzer present.
And I guess Stancer present also. So Doug did I wasn't quite sure what to do about the agenda. So Doug had drawn, Dr. Slaughter, I'm sorry, had drawn up a tentative agenda. And the first thing on that agenda was selecting the chair of the subcommittee.
Right.
So.
Because we haven't met in a while, I thought it would probably be an appropriate thing to do. So I can kind of take the meeting, ask for nominations, we can do a quick vote, and then whoever gets elected can take over from there.
Okay.
So I'm happy to do that.
All right, thank you.
Are there any nominations for chair? You can nominate yourself.
Sure, I'll nominate myself.
All right. Is there a second?
Lord second.
Are there any other nominations? Hearing none. Is there, we don't need to do stump speeches, I suppose. So I think we can probably take a roll call vote on this. In no particular order. Hala.
Lord, aye.
Margaret.
Aye.
Carrie.
Aye.
So we have a unanimous selection for chair. It's Margaret. You're on the short straw. So you can continue to lead the meeting.
Okay, thank you. So I think that I'm going to turn it over to you, Doug, to proceed.
Sure. So I think there's a couple different things that we've talked about relative to sort of getting started here, and I'm hoping we can, not take too much of your evening this evening. Hopefully you've had a quiet day inside because it was really awful out there. But a couple of things that I think we could do is I sent some history of ads and cut sheets. And of course, one of the things that I noticed, and this was something Margaret wrote me about earlier today, is that how we've defined the terms on those have not always been consistent or even within a year. And I think I've been guilty of this both in making those kinds of lists and also in being in a chair like yours and reading those kind of lists. And so there are things I think of as more permanent changes and things that are more sort of temporary changes in those adds and cuts and adjustments. And so I think we just, one thing we will probably want to do, just as a framing thing, is to define those clearly, and maybe we'll go back through the old lists and kind of retune those based on things that are temporary versus a more permanent kinds of change. And then I think just to sort of frame the whole of this, I think that's a useful sort of place to start. But I think we should think about, you'll probably talk just general timeline first off, and then, sort of what kind of benchmark times we have to meet, and then strategize about what kind of pieces we want to put together for, sort of telling the story, because I think that's really one of the sort of critical pieces here.
Okay.
So I have some suggestions about the definitions if we want to start there, just for something to kind of frame it a little bit and get.
Okay.
So there's adjustments, and then there's adds and typically cuts or reductions. And what I was thinking along those lines was that should be a little more disciplined about the use of the term adjustment to say that it's kind of a one-time change, not as much a permanent change. And things that are additions or reductions, or additions and cuts, are more permanent in nature or presumed to be permanent. So we have things where, like, we know a certain software is increasing in price. Well, that's actually an addition. It has typically been cast as perhaps an adjustment. An adjustment, on the other hand, there are times we'll make like this last year. We had we reduced the amount of money that we were going to put toward or on the budget line that pays for the MSAN membership. That was a 1-year adjustment to the budget. And we often do that. We have some that are there and up for consideration every year, around sabbatical leaves or what else? Things like that. Certain retirement incentives and the like. That I think are really more adjustments. They're more single year. They're things that we wouldn't permanently take out of the budgeting process. But on the other hand, there are in the additions and cuts piece, that's more, sort of more fundamental change or regularization of something. So if we need to, and especially at the region, so if a student we know is moving from sixth grade, one of our sixth grade buildings in Amherst or Pelham into the middle school, we know we're going to have them in a potential need for, say, a paraprofessional for that child or a particular kind of service. That's going to be a pretty permanent change for a number of years. And so that would be an add or a cut if someone graduated or something like that. So that would be my suggestion on those, to just, and that'll be if you guys are comfortable with that definition or you want to articulate it a bit more, that'd be great. But I think what I would need to do, in my role, is to make sure that I'm always sort of operating from that definition base, so that we're always telling the same story about how we're doing this. Because I think it's sometimes, as you look through those, it's like we cut almost every year except for 2 in the last 7. Which is true, and it is difficult to do. But there are many of those things that sort of come on and go off as far as cuts, because we don't want to permanently take them out of the budgeting, because there are things we really do all the time. But like retirement incentives or sabbaticals, that sort of thing. But they are ones that sometimes come up, and so being clear about those as we are public with this information is probably for the best. And that also requires, I think sometimes why we don't, adjustments always get put at the top, and then the action always happens down in the adds and cuts part. And I think what might be advantageous just on that adds and cuts kind of list is to be clearer about how it's evolving through the process. So as things go on or come off the list, sort of finding a way to demonstrate that either by dating the additions or organizing the layout in a way that makes it clear that it's progressing in a certain way, and then that way we can keep things in the categories as we've defined them and be consistent with that. So that I just think that would be helpful. I'm obviously open to suggestion from any of you about those things, but that's what I was thinking we'd start with as far as just thinking about adds and cuts, because that's really where most people spend the time thinking about the budget. They don't really dig into the specific lines. Some do, but because that's the point, that's where you're making those critical decisions about what is or isn't going to continue and how it's going to continue, and that's where the crux of the conversation happens when you're in the budget like we're going to be in this year.
Okay. So in some cases, FTEs were in adjustments, and in some cases they were most often in reductions, and there were many FTEs. I mean, I added up a total of 46, I think, over the course of these sheets that you've given us, which is, I mean, I know there's probably some other reasons for that than just money. There's like decreasing enrollment, but it would be helpful to know, I guess, the difference between ones that we're definitely saying these are going away or these are coming back,
Right.
versus this is like a one-time thing.
Right, and I think that's one of the difficulties in looking at those over time. And while I didn't get an opportunity this last year, often in years previous, the big budget book, you can there's a page in there that has FTE and it has FTE history, and so you can see how the FTEs sort of track over time, and they have decreased, not to that level that you're seeing there. I think for a couple of reasons. One is there's some growth in FTE during the fiscal year, sometimes depending on kids move in and it's not an option sort of thing. And so we take that on. And I think that the other point is that there are some of those changes that were more permanent than others. So, if you look at the year when we, cut back on the foods program, that loss of a teacher was permanent. That that position has not remained in place.
That was
there are-
culinary position.
Yeah, that was the culinary position, and then there's the child study position was the same year. I think some of the others are harder to characterize that way, but I think if we place those, that are more permanent into the cut section or the ad section, and those that are more temporary in basis, into that adjustment section, I think it'll be easier for people to kind of think about the whole and how much it's changing as far as FTEs are concerned.
Okay, so
Can I just ask one more thought? I think the other really big question with the FTEs is whether or not folks are being lost to attrition, or is it actual kind of layoff or I think layoff's the right word. So I think that's the other thing to think about when we're looking at those changes over time.
Yeah, they call it RIF, reduction in force. And we've been, as the superintendent has said, we've been fortunate in the last several years that retirement has generally captured that, and that's often how we prefer to do things. We've had a number of retirements. The baby boomers are retiring, and that's taking a sort of cluster of folks with them. But that's not a forever circumstance. So we will, and in a year like I think we're going to be experiencing this coming year, it's more likely to be, actual people we know, not just positions that go away. So it's unfortunate, but I think it's also very relevant to the conversation is when are we talking about doing it through, retirement and people choosing a different job and that sort of thing. And when is it, we're actually not doing as much stuff as we used to do. The one other thing I'd like to mention which is a difficult concept, I think, for people that kind of look at these is that, we talk about level services as we go from year to year, but each year, what is a level service is different than the year before.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's also a difficulty, is that the sort of frame from which we're building that new list is always different from the previous year. And part of that's just, kids are different. Part of it's because of the choices we made in the previous budget and so on. So that's a difficult thing to see. The other thing I think that sometimes is a little more subtle, it doesn't always get demonstrated, on that kind of a list, is there'll be times we have supply lines for all the different classes. And so, science has to buy, chemicals and petri dishes and that sort of stuff. And art classes buy paints and, clay and that sort of, those kind of supplies and textbooks and replacement books and those kind of things. Often we'll hold those with no change from one year to the next. And then, every few years we do need to actually increase those. And that's not something that often will show up on those documents. And I was having a conversation with Sean Mangano a few days ago about this topic and trying to prepare some stuff for the Four Towns meeting. And he said, yeah, we were fortunate. We'd gone 3 or 4 years without making any change at all to supply lines like that. And we had a ability one of those years that was a positive, that we can make a small increase to that because, those materials cost, sometimes don't change price much, but sometimes they do. But over a number of years, they definitely do. And so that's another more subtle piece. It's harder to sort of work into the conversation, but it is a real, it's a real number and it has a real impact.
Okay. So in terms of sort of re-identifying things, Doug, is that something that you can do?
I think largely I can. I mean, I'm familiar enough with most of it. And fortunately, Sean still works in town, so I can bug him. I don't remember, but there's plenty of them that I can tell just by looking. It's like, oh, that was much more, a one-time type of thing. When we have, I think even last year we had a small reduction in like health insurance costs because we knew we were, we had a couple of people that were leaving, and so we were shrinking because of the change in FTE. We knew that we'd have fewer, or a little bit less health insurance costs. So there's those kind of things that are identifiable as potentially temporary, and and many other things that are like that. There, there was one I was looking at where it had, a number of special education cuts, and they were, a few $1,000s, and fortunately it had the budget line, so I can actually look at those budget lines and see whether it's personnel or whether it was things, and whether it was because, a change in staffing or retirements. Sometimes it's retirements and you go, oh, well, this person was at the top step and had a PhD, and so they're very expensive and will probably not hire someone that expensive. So, those kind of things make their way into that as well. But I can go through those and kind of, sort of tune them up, I guess, as it were,
Okay.
and try to identify, things where it's, like Carrie was asking, is a RIF versus a permanent, a permanent versus a through attrition type of reduction in force.
Mm-hmm. So would the attrition, if somebody retired, when you say attrition, meaning we just wouldn't refill the position, that's
Right.
what you mean.
Right.
And so potentially some of those FTEs that were in the budget reduction section could have been retirees, not actual cuts to academic programs.
Well, it still results sometimes in that, so the sort of hidden piece of doing them through attrition is that, we're not actually putting a person essentially out on the street needing to look for work, but we are still having fewer people on staff. And so that could be some programming reductions as well.
Okay.
A lot of times with paraprofessionals, it kind of depends on, our student population and the needs of the students. And so sometimes, we have a class that has a few more students that have paraprofessionals and they leave, the kids graduate or whatever. And so our overall demand for staff goes down a little bit. Not too often, but it does happen. And likewise, we've had bump ups. A couple years ago, I think that incoming 7th grade class had 4 or 5 kids. And so there was a big bump. Maybe it was 7. Yeah, there was a big bump up in number of paras that one year. And those are, driven by who are the kids and who's coming. And obviously we won't know a lot of that information, until much later in the process, but we try to anticipate those if we can.
Okay.
It's the same with like the out of district placements, which, tend to be very expensive. But we try to have a sense of how many of those we have, because those can impact the budget in a pretty significant way. And those are, for me, those are always tricky, because we want to recognize and articulate the sort of financial impact, and yet not, identify students or families in any way. And so it gets a little more subtle. And likewise, when we talk about staffing reductions, we want to be very careful with those as well, because, it's an evolving process. We don't want to panic people. We have a requirement of how we do that relative to our contracts, like the timeline in which we need to do it, and the way in which we want to do it. And there's just a, sort of decent, decency factor there too.
Right.
So, those all play into the mix as we go along.
Okay. Well, it seems like if that would be one next step, would be to sort of have those a little clearer.
Can I? The other thing I was thinking that would help kind of with the telling the story and the data that would be useful in that is, I think, thinking about those special education out of district placements, it's not like we have the ability to say, no, we're not going to do that. We are legally mandated to pay for those, and we don't control the cost. So I think it would be really helpful to be able to kind of isolate the pieces of the budget where we are, like health insurance. It's not like we have any control over. They're big expenses that we don't have control over. And so where are these, places on the margin where we can, because I agree with you, Doug, like you don't want to like call attention and say, make people nervous this early in the budget process about where the cuts are going to be. But I think we know where they're not going to be, and where we don't have any flexibility. Right. And so
that's a good point.
It might be helpful in kind of illustrating like this fraction of the budget is, beyond our control, and regardless of how the town or the school committee feels about it, we're going to need to meet this cost. And these are the items where we might have some flexibility. But I think often they're the things that people are, make people excited about going to school and, sending their kids there. I mean, I believe that all of the things we do are important, but I think that in particular, some of the things that are optional, quote unquote optional, are the pieces that might be worth highlighting.
Right. And I think you're right. I think to, sort of define and outline for folks those parts of our budget that don't have wiggle room or have very little. And some of it, you gain more wiggle room as you move along because you learn new information. But I mean, another example where, we negotiate contracts that have steps, in COLAs. We don't have one right now, but we have to make an estimate assuming that will happen. And so that, is a bit of a black box that we have to put in place. We want to be respectful of the negotiation process, but we still have to put some estimates for those kinds of things into our budget. But I think you're right. There's things around ELL. There are things around special education in particular. Someone mentioned PE. Actually, it's required by law to offer PE. So you can't completely eliminate PE. You can count a lot of things. So like if a kid plays sports, you can count that as PE, but you have to offer that. Other quirky things, you technically have to teach flag etiquette. Not that anyone does, but you do. It's don't ask me why I stumbled across that in the law, but it's there. And what we really should do is get a booklet from like an American Legion or something like that and hand it out to everybody. But that's beside the point. But I think articulating those components that have more or less flexibility and what that means. And I think that for those that have we have more control over. That's the conversation about what do we make our school like. What do we, that's where you express your fundamental value system most in that area. And so, and that's where the debate really happens as far as, so what program are we offering? What's it cost to offer that program? Are we comfortable or uncomfortable with that? Is it important enough to offer it and challenge those who, that actually, authorize the appropriation to do that. And you have that debate of those things in context of other things those the communities are trying to fund.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay to have those conversations. I mean, they're uncomfortable sometimes, but I think that's the other piece is it's okay to have that debate about what is or isn't what we want.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Boy. I just, a couple of questions or thoughts that came to my mind as I was reading through all of these are that, along with level services and understanding that means we actually have less money because of the things that we can't control. Okay, where was I going with this? Oh, there's inflation.
Right.
So, we can't control that either. And it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't impact personnel, but it does impact things like the supplies and the bus, so it would be interesting, I think, to know what the inflation has been over this period of time that these sheets cover. Some people pay attention to that. Are we staying up with inflation?
Yeah, I can definitely. So interestingly, in our bus contract, we actually use an inflation factor to set the price. So they bid the contract. So the first year, so from last year to this year was a pretty big jump in price because it's a new contract. But there were the years after this are prescribed in the contract based on a consumer price index. So I can, I have several of those from previous years. I can go and look those up. And so that's a normed or standard, national standard of inflation we can use. And then we can also, the other sort of educational pieces that people know or don't know is, fully 80% of our budget is about people and their benefits. And so if health insurance goes up considerably or not, that makes a huge difference in what we can and can't do. If we, the contracts we negotiate with our employees, if their COLA, their cost of living adjustment, is bigger or smaller, that makes a big difference in our budgets as well. And so those are all, different knobs that we can turn in some respects. And sometimes, something like contracts we have to negotiate. So we have to come to terms with a group of employees about what that is, but it is one area that we have some leverage, I guess. The insurance we do because, only because we keep, either adjusting what, program we have, who we buy insurance from, what the plan looks like or doesn't look like, those kinds of things. There's a lot of it that's out of our control, but there are some things we can still adjust in that regard.
Another thing I thought would be interesting to know is number of students enrolled over this period of time. Where were we in 2014 in terms, we've heard about decreasing enrollment, so I think that would be something that would apply in this conversation as well.
Yeah, I think that, what's interesting is a fair amount of this information is and has traditionally been in our budget books. It wasn't last year, sorry. I will continue to apologize for that. I fully meant to, but I think the difficulty is that you get that budget book and it's 200 pages, and I think people just go and gloss over immediately. I mean, I know I do, and I work with it all the time. So I think to have a briefer and more concise, tool or pamphlet, as it were, to explain some of those things, is a good starting point for everybody. Because I think it gets everybody on the same page as far as understanding what the terms are, the definitions, the history in a nutshell. I think, and I said this at the meeting the other day, talking about student enrollment, is that while the enrollment may decline very smoothly over time, the changes you can make in, say, staffing and programs tend to come in stair steps. It's easier to sort of explain that case with an elementary school, because you either, if you think about Fort River, for example, it's like you either have 4 or 3 6th grade classes, right? When you get to the middle school, high school, where there's, a different, format, it's a little harder to sort of explain that same kind of thing happening. But what happens in that circumstance is you offer fewer sections of a particular elective. And so some kids can't get in because their schedule doesn't work. And so they end up in a study hall instead of in an academic class that they'd really like to take. And that's a much more subtle conversation, but it's still real as far as, what kids can and can't. There's the broad offerings like, well, how many foreign languages do we teach? But then more subtly is like, in departments we're not ever going to get rid of, we're always going to have a social studies department. Are we offering 3 or 2 or 4 elective classes to our juniors and seniors to choose from, which they need to graduate? Same with English, same with science, same with math, and then, as you get outside those critically core ones that are required for graduation requirements, when you get into your arts, your performing arts, your science, your technology, tech ed, those kind of things, then you have more latitude about how much of it you offer, or if you offer it at all. But again, if you don't offer any of it, then people start making other choices about where to go to high school.
Yeah. Ms. Bitzer, Carrie?
So I feel like, because I'm looking right now at the fiscal year 20 budget document, it's an amazing amount of information. And it must take a ton of time to put it together. So I'm very loath to ask for anything else, but I'm wondering, and I'd even be happy to work with somebody on this potentially, but I think it's something called program budgeting, where you don't just, because what you see when you look at this is you're looking at the English department, you see this much for teacher salaries, but you don't see the count of teachers, you don't see the count of class offerings. And the thing that gets tricky is when you're trying to tell a story, those are the details we need. So I'm not faulting the document. I think it's a good document, and if anything, you guys, it's got a lot of detail. And if somebody wanted to take the time, they could do it. But I think what we need to do is a little hand holding, and walk the public, through what these reductions are going to mean. And I think the only way to do that is to put meat on the bones. And that's going to be the things like, well, if we were to, make this, several $100,000 cut to this department, it's going to entail cutting this many, potentially cutting this many full-time equivalents. And it may mean a reduction in our course offerings from this to this. In particular, these are the courses that might, that are optional and we could leave off the table. I don't know, Doug. I guess I'm looking at you for if that's something we could do, or if it's just too much. And you guys are totally overtaxed right now, so I'm trying to think of a way we could collaborate to do this so that you're not the only one who's having to take the time on this, because it's a lot. But I do have some experience with program budgeting from prior work experience, and I think it's the way that we communicate with the public the best, because I don't think anybody's going to make their way through this 200-page document.
Yeah, and I would suggest, it's a circumstance where what I might suggest in that regard would be to sort of generically speak to a department and maybe set it up that way and sort of say, here's, you have Department X, could be English, science, math, social, it doesn't matter the department. Here's what it takes to offer, this many courses, certain are required, and kind of play it out that way a little bit. So it's less specific to any particular department. And of course, you'd have a little bit different model at the middle school because they use the team model. So the structure and so some of it's built on, well, how are our classes offered? Like, well, how many sections, how many periods do we have? What's our rotation of classes? That sort of thing. So it's partly about scheduling and partly about what staffing it takes to do X number of sections and that sort of stuff. And so I can reach out. Some of that material is stuff that the principals in high school, middle school definitely have, sort of readily to mind, because as they think about how they staff and how they change, they have that kind of in their thoughts. So I think we might be able to do a sort of generic department and sort of, what that impact looks like. Because then you can talk about, average teacher salary and sort of, so like when Mike said, oh, it's 26 teachers, that's because it's an average salary he's using to project that. And so we could do something similar, I think, to have that conversation about sort of, how it starts to impact. It doesn't impact. It's not the full story because it doesn't talk about sort of the interrelationship between the departments, which is a little more subtle kind of scheduling problem. But I think it might be a way to do it that's not completely, like a zero-based budgeting from the ground up kind of thing. That would be a whole other project. But I think that might be a manageable approach, and I think a useful thing that we could kind of build and work. And I'm going to need to have some of those kinds of conversations with principals here in the next few weeks as we start to meet and talk about budget. So, I think I can keep that kind of frame in mind as I have those conversations to think about that, because I think that's as you were sort of suggesting. I think it's a powerful and concrete way to describe it to people without getting into the subtlety of the 15 budget lines that talk about PD and supplies and all those kinds of nuanced things that we like to track and need to track for some state reporting purposes, but kind of create a bit of a blur when people start to look at them if they're not needing to know the specific lines. So I'm just to recap, if I can, where we're at right now on this. I'm thinking about so on the adds and cuts, I think sort of renorming those to a stricter set of definitions. Looking at on FTE changes, particularly identify those that were sort of permanent changes. Well, and generally across the board, sort of permanent versus temporary types of changes, but also things that were accomplished through attrition versus through actual loss of employment. And then, sort of framing certain aspects of the budget that we know are less mobile than others or less under our control versus those that we do have control. Some sense of inflation over the period, that's a fairly simple thing. Sort of student enrollments over the last several years, that's easy stuff to pull together.
Okay.
And then let me make one more note here about just sort of that the notion of a program, whether it be a department or a team, and sort of sort of what and how it's shaped, and what's involved when you sort of as you make cuts to things, sort of what kind of decision points are there with offerings and FTEs and that sort of thing.
Can I add two thoughts?
Everything in short.
I'm not going to add work, but I think the inflation factor, and this is something I brought up at the last meeting, could also be COVID factor. So like what new costs do we have related to COVID that aren't going to be covered by any CARES Act dollars in the next year? So what are we now going to, I mean, I know it's a big unknown, but I think there is going to be some fixed cost going forward that's not going to go away. And then the other thought I had was just to put it out there. Is that if the frame of like doing a program budget doesn't work, then we could also maybe think about like, what would these cost reductions mean to the typical kid? So like, Johnny in 9th grade is, now I'm going to get to choose from only 2 languages instead of 4. I'm just thinking, again, I don't want to go into the specifics, but I think we need to either frame it around a program or frame it around a person, and just to give it a face, not necessarily a face of a person, but it could be a program, but just something for people to latch onto. So I just wanted to put that out there if that's an easier way of thinking about how to frame the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly open to that. I'll mention this to Mike and see what he thinks. He may have some really good sort of insights into, or stories from colleagues about what worked well or didn't work well in their conversations in their communities. What told a good story, what was not too burdensome for them to put together, or that sort of thing. But I do think it like I said the other day, that as much as folks may have that are on the council in particular, but this is true in any of the communities, your experience in those things is very different. Well, there's how much experience you have, and then there's also what that experience has been. So, the last couple of years for the council in Amherst in particular has not been particularly difficult as far as budgeting is concerned. The state was doing pretty well, the economy was doing pretty well, and so the choices, you're still making difficult choices because you're always wanting to do more things than you have resources for. But it's different than I think we're going to face this year, and so I think it's critical that we have good ways to sort of make the case for the district, but also just explain what their choices are and the impacts of those choices.
Okay. So Doug, this sounds like a lot of work for you. Is there anything that I can help with or others of us can help with at this point? I mean, right now it's like information gathering, I guess.
Yeah. And, I mean, some of this is stuff I need to do anyway, because it's kind of part of putting the larger book together, and it'll be part of the, it's a natural part of the process.
Okay.
And so I think that, that's the case. If after I get the really bare bones stuff together, I'll probably share it out with you guys, and then that may be where you'll have, much more desire or willingness, capacity to sort of, put more narrative to it, or think about how that narrative is going to play out, and what else we might need to augment sort of telling the story. But to start with here, I'm certainly happy to do this, and it's all part of what I've got to do for both internally and and externally. So it's not part of the job.
Okay. All right. Paula, do you have any questions or thoughts in particular you'd like to put forward?
No, I think they've been covered.
Okay.
My learning curve is being exposed, but I'm also writing a lot down and just there's so many unknowns because we don't know what our enrollment's going to look like, what our requirements in terms of PPE, how many people on the bus. So
Right.
I don't admire your job, Dr. Slaughter, but thank you for doing it.
It was a heck of a time to sort of take on this job. You know, like, that's not so bad. Then COVID hits, and it's a whole new ballgame in some respects. So, you know, every day I'm more appreciative of the kinds of stuff and the amount of stuff that Sean, you know, did for us. You know, there's a lot going on that he took care of. You know, and I'm not sure always everybody knew exactly how much that was, but I'm coming to appreciate more and more.
I guess I do have one question that came up at the SETF meeting in terms of it. Okay, so we as a school committee or the budget subcommittee, is it ours to go to the town and say we actually need more than level? I think that's what I heard Peter saying. I'm a little slow. I need to hear it a lot, or Mr. Demling. But that might be, when we look at it, that's something we can do and say we can't make. Well, obviously we'll have to make it, but is that one of those things where we sort of reach out to the town council people?
Right. I think how we do that is going to be, you know, interesting. I mean, you know, as we spoke at the school committee the other night, I mean, I think in general, the relationship between the school committee and the various towns has been pretty decent over the years. You know, the towns have had their conflicts about how they think we should fund things. I mean, that's another piece to this, is so there's, how do we, you know, assess this cost, you know, sort of what burden does each town bear, and then how much should we be actually spending? And both of those are simultaneously kind of in the mix. And so we have to, you know, navigate that a little bit. But I do think that when it gets down to brass tacks, you know, we need all 4 towns to agree to an assessment method. In other words, how we're going to divvy up the cost, and then 3 of the 4 to say, yes, I'm going to pay that. Because if 3 of the 4 do it, then the 4th one has to.
All right, and that's not something we do before our next 4 towns meeting anyway.
No. So we got time on that. So we got lots of time on that, because I think, you know, this kind of leads naturally into kind of next topic, which is sort of what is our timeline. I mean, traditionally, you know, school committee votes the budget in March. We're probably going to still need to meet that deadline, because you know, the town meetings happen in late April and early May, and there's deadlines for getting the warrants put together and all that. So I think we'll still have the same, you know, trajectory of March for us approving a budget to recommend to folks. Obviously, between now and then, we're going to have lots of conversations about, you know, what's the cost, what are the pros and cons, what do we think we should be doing, and what we, you know, can or will do. And, you know, the towns have their responsibility. If they say no, you know, if we offer up a budget and say, this is what we think should happen, and they go, no, that's not what's going to happen because we can't afford it, then we have to go back and sort of go, okay, well, then we're going to have to work with something else. And, you know, we all want it to go nice and smooth. It may not. It's okay. It's okay to, you know, I mean, it's trickier because you started getting a time crunch on some stuff, but the state has mechanisms, you know, if we don't get a budget approved, and, you know, we hope not to be there, but at the same time, it is maybe complex enough that that's where we end up. So that's also, you know, I think, to the superintendent's point, you know, you guys are a committee that, you know, you set the budget, and you know, you're going to make the decisions you think are best for the kids that are coming. Obviously, not being completely blind to what the, you know, economic realities are of the communities, but at the same time, you know, you get to make that choice, and then make the people who appropriate the money make their choice.
Mm-hmm. And then deal with the result.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not right. So we don't have to start out saying, okay, we're going to cut all that money. We can say, this we think is a reasonable way to go this year. And then they can tell us if they'll do it or not.
Right. And I think that, you know, I'm you know, the numbers that we put out, you know, that I put out in the last couple of weeks, very rough. So there'll be things that change. I mean, we're hopeful that, like, our health insurance won't go up 5%. I mean, we picked 5%. we've had better luck in the last couple of years. If that goes down, like a percentage points, I forget the number off. It's $100,000 or $200,000. I mean, that's how big a number it is. So those kind of things can make huge, positive or negative impacts. Hopefully positive, which is why we take a conservative approach to start. So I think that's one area that could be a positive for us. I'm hoping is a positive for us. But there are others that we don't know, and
Mm-hmm.
we've made some what we hope are decent guesses to start with, but things are going to change a lot in the next 6 weeks, because the governor will come out with his budget, and I will say I caught the last like 4 or 5 minutes of the at the State House, the chairs of the two Ways and Means had a revenue projection meeting. They do it this time every year.
Mm-hmm.
They get a lot of different economic advisors to sort of offer their suggestion as to what the tax revenues are looking like. Surprisingly good.
Yeah, I read that somewhere that
So
it's higher.
that's reassuring that that funding will at least be kind of level, which is a whole lot better than it could be. So if our funding from the state stays kind of level, that makes it a lot easier for the towns as well as the schools to plan. That doesn't mean we still don't have money to make up in other places, but it does help.
So, Doug, when would you? So, I mean, you probably at this point would be making a guess, but perhaps an educated guess on when would it? Thinking about the timeline, you're saying we would probably still have to approve a budget in March.
Yeah,
So,
I think unless the towns are going to move their town meeting like they did last year, which would change sort of the dates. I know in Amherst they have a much later approval process. I think they're in May and June, whereas with the town meetings, they're the last weekend of April and the first weekend of May, and so. And they need a 30 or 45 day lead time for the warrant and all that.
So at what point would you expect to say, okay, this is where I think we're going to be on these things that right now we don't have any idea? I mean, what's your hope or best guess on when you might be there?
Well, so health insurance, we'll find out in January. They usually, the MIA, which is our agent for our health insurance, and they're part of MMA, which is the Mass Municipal Association. The Mass Municipal has a meeting in like the third week of January, and it's usually during that weekend of that meeting that MIA makes their projections. So that's one number that's a pretty big number that will help us get clarity. About that same time is when the governor kind of releases his budget, so they've got an estimate of what Chapter 70 is going to look like at that point. So,
okay,
kind of, in that point in January, we'll know a little bit more about both of those that have a pretty significant impact on the overall budget. They're not solid, the health insurance one will be kind of a firm number at that point, but the Chapter 70 still has to go through its usual process. And so, I think that what's probably likely to happen is, and I haven't had a conversation with the superintendent about this, but I'm guessing that it may make more sense for the 4 towns to get together pretty late in January, because I think we'll have another good set of numbers at that point. But that would also be a good time to have kind of a document together that's got this sort of history and fundamentals of the budget put together.
okay,
That's kind of what I was thinking of, is that
okay.
we can kind of gather this stuff and kind of polish it a little bit, and because it's it's about things that are known, our history, and or things that can be described somewhat generically, and again are fairly fixed, and so we can kind of, I think, put that together and have that
Okay.
Available in anticipation of that meeting, maybe have that and send it out to people in advance. And then, but I think that, and the superintendent may differ on this opinion. I'm just thinking about the sort of, drop a quick glance. If we had I'd hate to say the 30th of January because that's the sort of last Saturday, but that might be the
town
that
meeting.
might be a target 4 towns meeting that might have some real significant, at least reasonable numbers to put in place. We should have health insurance at that point. We should have some greater clarity from the governor as far as his budget is concerned, which will help really kind of start the frame.
Okay.
Also have a sense on how much people are going to debate that. So, our representatives in the House and Senate would have some sense about how much the governor's budget has people fired up to make a change to it.
Okay.
So
All right.
I mean, that's kind of the, and then from that sort of late January, I just think, I mean, it would, in some ways, it'd be nice to meet a little before that. I just don't know that we'll have enough new information.
Okay.
I may talk to the superintendent. He and I and Doreen Cunningham are going to have a meeting tomorrow and talk about sort of budget. We're going to have it earlier in the week. We pushed it back to today. So we're going to lay out sort of a timeline for ourselves as well. So he may have a very different take on that. I'll let you know if he does. Okay. But I think that for me, what I'm thinking is this sort of background information that I think is useful. It's always useful, but to kind of get that put together over the next month, basically, and then try to get that out to folks so they can be prepared to have the conversation when we have a little better numbers to come toward the end of January would be where I think we could be. And then from that late January to March is when, we get a lot deeper into questions about what's our assessment method and what's our choices we're making relative to what programs we're offering and how much and what kind. I mean, that's when that real debate is happening and the deep thinking about the specifics starts to happen in that really month and a half, 2 month span between the late January and mid-March.
So you're anticipating that if we had another 4-town meeting at the end of January, that would be the point at which there would actually be a vote on the assessment method?
I think that would be lovely. Whether I think that would really happen, I don't know.
Okay.
But I think that what we could do is potentially get a deeper commitment from folks about their comfort level.
Okay.
Which is often what happens. A lot of times will happen in the December meeting, because there are a lot less variability. As much as you don't really know what Chapter 70 is going to look like, you don't really know what state aid is going to look like. You have a sense of it at that point, a little bit, from.
Not this year.
So, but not this year. So and so oftentimes we kind of take everybody's temperature in December about what assessment methods they thought they could afford, and sort of the level of funding they thought they could afford. I think Pelham was probably clearest in that regard. At our last meeting, but I think that kind of conversation is more of what we'll have in late January, and then I think we might have another one in February where we really kind of do what we usually do at the second one, where we really get a firmer commitment from everybody to sort of back a particular idea. That's how I see it playing out. Whether others may have different points of view on that, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
So I'm thinking for us then, we will wait for information from you. And once we have that, then I think we need to consider what we want to do with that information, how we want to present it. And we want to have that ready probably a week before that 4-town meeting.
Yeah.
So that it would go out to people and they would actually have time to go over it.
Right.
And that means we would probably need to get together earlier in January rather than later. So,
what I would suggest is sort of this this sort of fact gathering stuff and putting some things together for you guys, it won't be in as polished a state as it will ultimately be in, but getting that together basically kind of by the end of this month.
Okay.
And then we could
All
meet
right.
maybe that first couple of days of January.
Okay.
And then we can kind of divvy up the tasks at that point, as far as what is the sort of product going to look like. And again, I think about this is about telling that sort of story. What's the background? What's the frame? What's the, as we discuss the particulars a little later in the month, where are the the places of flexibility or inflexibility. So everybody's operating from a similar understanding and a similar history. That's kind of what I'm thinking is going to be reasonable.
All right.
And, it would be nice if we could kind of, if not a few days, a week, if not a week, at least 3 or 4 days before that, get stuff out to people so they have a chance to kind of spend some time with it. Would be beneficial, I think, so that,
Okay.
because when we talk about these assessment methods, if you haven't like really dug into the nitty-gritty of them over the years, they are super complex. I mean, just the Chapter 70 formula, the statutory method, just on its own, what's involved in what's called a minimum contribution. Those are really complex formula with a lot of deep thinking about it, but a lot of debate about what is or isn't an appropriate way to fund schools, and we can get into that. And it's not that we don't want to get into those weeds, but we do want to be. We don't want to get bogged down in that either.
Right.
That can get to a place where it's like not constructive to really going, well, what can we afford? What do we want to afford? And what do we think is the right trajectory for us as a district?
Okay. All right. So then what I should do with you is, boy, the time is going by, is sometime before the first of the year, set a meeting date. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like everybody, I'm not going anywhere. So, regardless of which holidays one might celebrate, there's not a lot of places to go.
Okay.
So, I'm kind of around.
All right.
But what I will do is, as far as putting this stuff together, I'll try to get that out to everybody as soon as I can, so you can start to look at it, think about it, and then when we can have those conversations. You can post questions and see if there's something missing in that, so that when we actually meet again like this, we'll be ready to think about how we sort of shape this into something for the broader public to look at.
Okay.
So. I would suggest connect with me the last week of December.
Okay.
And we'll set an actual date and talk about agenda specific stuff. But I will try to get materials to you in and around that same time frame.
Okay.
So you guys can look that stuff over and kind of think about it, and think about different ways to sort of present it and explain it, and have people interpret it.
Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions before we adjourn? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I will take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Lord. All right. We'll take a roll call vote. Hala,
Lord, I.
Carrie, and Margaret. Aye.
That's all right.
The meeting's adjourned, and thank you all.
Thank you all. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you. Have a
Bye.